Hi, I'm Jeremy Epstein. I'm a computer scientist specializing in cybersecurity for the past 30 years, and in particular on voting and election security.
Hi, I'm Delegate Hala Ayala, representing the District 51 in Prince William County, and also with a cybersecurity background.
Hello, I'm Michael Shea. I've been an election official in Arlington County, and I have many years of experience as an economist. Please join us in conversation. When I think about issues like cybersecurity, and not just with regard to elections, I feel like it is one of those things that it's got a technical level that's like medicine, which means most people not in the field don't want to understand it. And now with medicine, once you get sick, you make yourself understand, you get the doctor. This is one of those things, particularly with elections, that people don't realize they need to be engaged with at some level because you want to have confidence and you want to be able to understand when there's problems. So do you think we need an engagement campaign, or what can we do to make the people understand the issues more effectively?
Well, I think 10 or 20 years ago, nobody really understood cybersecurity in the public. I used to say that I worked in, long before it was called cybersecurity, and people would say, oh, do you work on antivirus? And I was like, well, no, I don't. There's a lot more to security than that. Nowadays, it's pretty easy to convince people you need to have good passwords, and you need to be aware of keeping your computers patched, things like that. So it's a lot easier to get people understanding. There's a basic level of understanding now that we didn't have 10 or 20 years ago. But getting them to understand that those same basic security requirements that we have in our everyday lives also apply to voting and elections, and these are critical to our democracy.
And you talk to a lot of people around the Commonwealth.
I do.
And do you find people need to, what would you say about people? Do they need to understand it more, and how can we do that?
I would say, one, they're afraid of us. You know, when they hear cybersecurity, it's a big umbrella. It's not just, right, as Jeremy said, it's just not one item of security or one mechanism or platform that you do to make sure that a system or electoral system is secured. I think with the 2016 elections, it is heightened it in the media, right, about what is good user or average user security practices and principles. I think that we are still educating our public. We are still giving them information. And thank God for Google. You know, if they don't remember anything that we say to them or communicate to them, they can go out and Google it if they remember what I said.
Do you think Virginia, and I guess I would say this is more of a governor, lieutenant governor, mm-hmm, more of an administrative role. Do you think they're doing a good job in making people aware and making people understand? Or is there more we can do?
I think there's more we can do. Technology is always evolving. It's never static, right? It's always dynamic. And I think as we understand the 2016 elections, what exactly happened, I think that'll be a part of the conversation. And I think a part of the conversation will be good data governance. You know, how do we protect our data? Right. You know, we talk about Facebook, and I think the general consensus or the general first response is, oh my God, what does that mean? My computer's been hacked, right? And then you have to bring them back, mm-hmm, down off the ledge and explain to them that the policy or the privacy policies, they were not simple and understanding to the average person. And there's things like two-factor authentication that we can do in order to protect our passwords. So I'll use banking, for instance. You know, you get a card with a chip in it, that's one authentication, and then you have your password, right, and then you have access. So they can relate to that. And I think that, again, there's more than we can do. I'm, right, actually the first cybersecurity specialist to be elected to the General Assembly. We have a lot of IT professionals, and they do touch on mechanisms or mechanics of cybersecurity. I think we all are getting more involved. Right.
I think the two-factor works incredibly well. We have a teenage son, and sometimes he loses the bank card, and you lose one of the factors. So we have to do more.
The human factor.
The human factor is a big part of this. So where are we in terms of elections in Virginia, in terms of security? What's your sense of where the Commonwealth is?
The Commonwealth is actually doing pretty well. When I started working on elections in Virginia 15 years ago, we were one of the most backward states in terms of the security of our systems. We were using what are called DREs, direct recording electronic touchscreen voting machines in most of Virginia 15 years ago. Those systems have long been suspected and more recently proven to be extremely insecure, and that was where we were, and a number of us worked for many years to change the laws to disallow them. In 2015, the state finally started looking at it, and they found that in fact they were worse than we had predicted, and they made a pretty radical decision to quickly move away from them and move to paper ballots. That shifted Virginia from being one of the most backward states in terms of security to right in the middle or slightly ahead of the pack in a very short period of time. Where Virginia is still behind in terms of the security of elections themselves is that we have a very weak audit law in Virginia. We have a law that was passed in, I think it was 2015, that took effect this year, maybe it was 2016, but it took effect this year, that requires some very limited audits, but there's a lot of problems with the law. There was an effort to pass a better law last year, but that law did not pass the legislature. So we have a very weak law, but it's better than no law. So we're better than it could be. But that's only the election part. There's also the whole infrastructure, the voter registration systems, the tallying systems, et cetera. And that's a whole different challenge that hasn't been looked at very much.
But just to back up for a second, the machines you referred to, as we found they were worse than we thought.
The state found that
they found.
Right.
They found that by testing. They didn't find that because of some horrendous examples.
Well, actually what happened,
Right,
there's kind of a funny story about that. I had been trying to convince the legislature for quite a number of years, for over a decade, that they should actually, the government should take a look at it. And then in the 2015 November election, in a polling place, and I don't remember where it was, there were complaints that every time someone tried to download music on their iPhone, the voting machines crashed. And nobody could figure out why this is. And so they started investigating. They never did figure out why downloading music caused the voting machines to crash. But as a side effect of doing that, they discovered that the password that was being used by those voting machines was ABCDE for protecting their Wi-Fi network. And the administrator password, which you could not change, was, I can't remember if it was administrator or password. And with that information that I just told you, you could undetectably change every vote in the voting machine that was in use in 30% of the state, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Once they looked at those, they replaced those, and then they, a little bit later, they looked at all the other voting machines in the state, and they weren't quite as bad as the model that I had talked about at first. But that sort of gave a wake-up call. So it wasn't the election has been hacked, because in fact we don't know if the election was hacked. Some recent data that was published last month shows that some of the voting machines that were in use in Virginia had been used in peer-to-peer networks, and some of them had been downloading. I can't remember what it was, but there was evidence that the voting machines had been used in ways that officially they shouldn't have been used. How that happened, we have no idea.
Wow, and we should say this is, when he refers to trying to get the government to, you weren't in the legislature yet.
No, you must be talking about Governor McAuliffe.
It was while he was in office.
Yes.
I don't know that he had anything to do with it, but it was when he was in office.
A funny anecdote about Governor McAuliffe on election day, of course, 2014, and I mean 13, when he was running for office, he goes in and he says, I pushed my name and it went to Ken Cuccinelli's name. And then he pushed his name, and then it would go to, he was like, what is going on? He said, well, with the average voter, would have probably pushed, send or submit, or accept, if they didn't pay attention to what was happening. That actually happened to me. I would put Governor McAuliffe, it highlight Ken Cuccinelli, and I'm like, hey, I'm screaming, what's going on? They ended up rebooting the systems, because 90% of the problems could be helped by rebooting, just joking. But they rebooted the systems, they made us wait out, and then we came back in. It worked, and
Right.
Or at
Governor
least you think it worked.
Jeremy, he's so hostile. Well, we never know, and that's just the thing. It produces. They didn't produce a paper trail, so we just didn't have no way to verify.
And so when you, with your experience, with your background, bring up these issues in Richmond, do you find, with your colleagues, do you find there's still a bit of a misunderstanding or resistance? Or
I think it's just
receptive?
the better word for me would be continuing education.
Okay.
I think that if you understand system security, you understand, that application, you can pretty much understand the fundamentals for any system that you need to secure and what you need to do to get there. But when you're talking about the General Assembly, there's a lot of lawyers there, and, if they want to make the policy, if they want to talk about the fundamentals of it, we can get there. And I think they're really receptive to, change. I think it's scary for all of us that sit in a seat, that because of somebody hacking into a system or because of some, flaw, we could lose an election. And governing the people is very important to us.
Right.
So that's what matters most. And so I think there's a lot of receptiveness and continuing education.
Is there any legislation that you think, you're referring to the bill that didn't pass last year, would that be reintroduced, do you think? Or is there more, what's coming up? It's
So
hard
it
to say at
passed
this
the
point.
House. 25 of us voted against it. I was one of those
Okay.
individuals. The first part of the bill is great. I 100% agree with it, but then on line 121 you read, what does it say? Will repeal the previous code in Virginia, which includes auditing. Now, granted, I agree with you that we can do better, but Mark Levine stood up in the middle of the floor on that bill, and I love Mark, Delegate Levine.
Delegate Levine.
He does a very spirited conversation on the floor or debate. And one of the things we had in private, a conversation, and he said, hey, let me put it to you this way. If I have an old clunker of a car and I'm driving it around and somebody says, hey, I'll give you a new car, but you got to get rid of the old one for 2 years. That's essentially what line 121 did. It was supposed to form a working group, which I don't oppose to, but you can't get rid of the old in order to improve the new. You have to keep what you have and then look at ways that you can consistently build upon it. So I was against that.
Okay.
I can't see us repealing something and then wait for 2 years and say, hey, maybe I will or will not put it back in.
Do you think a version of it that doesn't repeal will be introduced? Is that possible?
I can't say.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's up
it's
to,
far too early.
because Delegate Levine introduced a bill about improving the audit portions of our election systems for security purposes, and I think was Delegate Cole followed him, and then last year was Tim Hugo. And so everything was good up to line 21,
Right.
121, and then I was like, okay, can't do
Yeah.
this. And
Yeah.
so I agree. It's like with anything. You have policies that sometimes have to continually evolve
Right.
with, the times, and you just can't throw the baby out with the water. You have to really assess. And I'm not sure what this working group was going to be made up of. Was
Right.
it going to be experts? Was it going to be people that really understood what the Virginia Code was about and what the regulations are currently and what we can do collectively as a body to improve this? So I'm all about security, probably too much security, and I am for improving our audit system here in Virginia. And we've changed our election systems. We've gotten a paper trail. They run assessments on it. They make sure they measure. They talk about the risk and the effectiveness of it. So I think we're taking good steps here in Virginia.
Do you feel like there's a bill that can be introduced this year that will be helpful? Or not?
I expect there will be. I'm not involved in
Right.
that, but I do expect that it'll be introduced again, and I think the objections about the 2-year delay, I wasn't part of that discussion, but I would guess that folks would be willing to put it into place faster. I know the advocates who are working in that area are not anxious for a delay. They're anxious for it to come faster. So I'm not sure where the 2-year delay came from. I suspect it didn't come from the advocacy folks. I suspect it came from somewhere inside the legislature, but I don't know. I'm not familiar with the background
I think
on
if they
that.
start talking about authentication, I thought that, they talk about, we still have to have that human factor engaging in elections. You just can't, say that this is going to be 100% secure, because that's a falsehood, but we can take measures, ways to, authenticate ourselves as we're going to we do it anyway. We show our license. That's just one step.
Right.
Maybe we can talk about what these machines' capabilities are and add another step, There's just so many things that could be discussed. I think that as we look to 2019 General Assembly, we will have a spirited dialogue again.
Well, we look forward to following that.
Absolutely.
I think one of the things that is going to be interesting to watch in the legislature is the question of internet voting seems to come up in every session of the legislature, and I agree with you absolutely.
I'm like,
it's terrifying. Why would we think that? Why would anybody in this day and age think it's a good idea? But I sat on a commission recently, a couple of years ago, organized by the General Assembly to make recommendations, and the recommendations were don't do it, and if you're going to do it, it's going to be expensive,
Yes.
and it's going to have these problems. And despite the recommendations of the expert committee, which was composed of legislators and technology experts like myself, legislation was introduced to begin doing internet voting anyway. And anyone who is a technical expert is sort of scratching their heads going, why would anyone think this is a good idea in this day and age? But my bet is there will be another bill introduced in the 2019 session by somebody who wants to see internet voting. And the people who are doing it are well-meaning. There's no question. Their vision is to make it easier for military and overseas voters. And that's a worthy goal, and I think everybody agrees on it. But we have to make sure that in the process of carrying out that worthy goal, we don't put our democracy at risk.
Yeah.
And so that's the challenge.
In addition to military and overseas, is it also believed that just everyone in the Commonwealth will get a higher voting rate?
Well, that's a really interesting. The evidence is actually very clear that it doesn't improve turnout where it's been tried.
Right.
What it does is it shifts some people who otherwise would have gone and voted in person instead vote online. It does not increase turnout among young people. In fact, it tends to increase, which is the hypothesis, because they assume we all assume that's the generation that's the digital natives. But in fact, introducing internet voting tends to increase voting among older people and decrease among younger people. Completely different from what you would expect. The only state that has allowed everybody to vote on the internet is Alaska. And that was until a few months ago. After they saw just how vulnerable all our systems are, they backed off.
But in remote areas like Alaska, they probably had a stronger motivation to want to make that work.
Right. And as an example, there was a great study done by the British Columbia, the province of British Columbia in Canada, where they concluded in a major study about 5 years ago that internet voting was a really bad idea, but if you were going to do it, you would start with the really remote areas where it was really hard to get to a polling place. And so, yes, there's somewhat more rationale for doing it in Alaska than in a relatively urbanized state like Virginia. But even so, it's a really, really bad idea.
And when you refer to some people that would come in to vote that don't, I do think there's some people that active, there are not enough of these people because that we have a low voting turnout rate, but there are some people who that active voting is a very important and meaningful moment for them. I was working at a poll in Arlington, the one over by George Mason University Arlington campus. And
It's
unfortunately,
actually a nice one.
It's a nice one, but it has a very long, from the street, it's a very long walk to get to the door. And there was a gentleman who I am going to guess is in his 80s or 90s, and he had a walker. And he was accompanied by a woman in a medical sort of like physician or like scrubs, like looking at me. So he was, I think, and I think he was coming from an assisted living facility. Don't really know. The point is, he put on a really nice suit, and he, made his way across very slowly, very proudly. And when I relayed that to people, they immediately said, "Oh, well, they can come to the curb," or and all these things. But I think for him, it was going in and voting that's what you want to do, and I think that the voting takes that away.
Well, I think if you meet people who are naturalized American citizens, many of them, especially people who have come from repressive countries, take great pride in coming and participating in this most American of rituals, coming to the polling place and voting, marking their paper, dropping it in the ballot box, knowing that it counts. I think we can't underestimate the importance, and that gets lost when you click a button.
Right.
We need to make sure we recognize that democracy is about participation, which is why I'm also a poll worker. I'm precinct 841 in Fairfax County. I'm the chief for that precinct.
All right.
All right. Well, I agree with the internet voting. I am not a fan. There is so much that can go on. We have viruses, we have costs, we have access issues. Again, I am a proponent of making sure we have that human interaction as our checks and balances.
Right.
And I love my apps, or I love the internet. Thank God for the internet, but it's a double-edged sword. There's a duality to it.
Right.
And I think that the cost to secure an internet voting system could be quite costly. You're talking about upkeep, you're talking about maintenance, which is one and the same, protection, all of those nuances that come with, protecting our elections. I think West Virginia last year piloted the internet. I don't know what the results were, I don't know what their findings were, but I think West Virginia, I don't know what parts either, piloted this internet voting. And scary.
Yeah,
Very scary.
West Virginia has done a number of pilots over the years, most recently, as you say, using a commercial company that is using a lot of hype and saying we use blockchain and therefore it's secure. And they actually are not using blockchain if you understand the technology, and even if they were, blockchain doesn't secure voting.
Right.
So there's a tremendous amount of hype around use of technology and being highly buzzword compliant, as we say, which means they aren't actually doing what they are claiming, but they're using the right buzzwords. You can't prevent somebody from calling something blockchain because there's no trademark. It's not like saying you can't call that Kleenex because it's not Kleenex.
Right.
Anybody can call anything they want blockchain, whether it is or not,
yeah.
and that's exactly what's happening.
Well, they say, hey, we're owning the data, we're talking about, we're the only ones that have access, et cetera, et cetera. But I would agree with you. It's still that blockchain technology, and always associated with bitcoins and that financial systems. We do have systems that are, testing this out. But in a voting election system, I'm just not sure we're evolved, just yet to use that type of technology. And I think it could be possible. One could argue, or proponents of it could argue, that blockchain, we're here to save the day, or, let's open up the hood and see what's under there.
Right. So do you feel like there's anything we can do to encourage voting? This is aside from a cybersecurity issue, but just encourage voting by celebrating it more? I mean, how can we in Virginia get more people to come out to the polls and want to do it, do you think? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there's traditional methods. Last year in 2017, we had presidential-like turnouts.
Right.
And I think there's a factor there, right? We have a gentleman on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue sitting up there that people were not a fan of, or they may have been. But we saw
Either way.
Either way. We did voter registration drives. We talked about, we educate Virginians. We are very big on grassroots organizing. We talk about covering the polls, as you gentlemen do. We talk about possibly being those election officers. We talk about methods and way you can get engaged. But I think individually, you have to make sure that people know that, especially a state like Virginia, we have elections every year, where to go, what they need to do,
Right.
what they need to bring with them, and then make sure that they're registered to vote. And I think that everybody now more than ever has a heightened sense of their democracy is at stake, and also their duties as citizens
Right.
to vote, and in my district, I come from a district that has a lot of cybersecurity scientists and government workers and military workers, and they are very much aware that Virginia practices elections every year, and that they were like, hey, we're going to the polls, and they did, they showed up.
Yeah.
So I just think those traditional methods still work. Going door to door, that personal touch,
Right.
talking to high school students, they have opportunities in government classes to register to vote, make sure that they know when to vote.
Right.
And
Most
so-
of them, or a lot of them, are 18 during or before their senior year.
Hey,
And
we
they
should
can come
talk
out
about
vote.
automatic, enrollment for voting, as soon as you turn 18 years old. I mean, even if you sign up online, you can sign up online. You still have to go in and verify who you are.
Right.
And I'm not in disagreement with that method, because you need to see the ID, which is your authentication. You need to verify that this is the person standing up, in front of you, and it's not Vladimir Putin, Just joking. Bad joke.
Well, I agree with everything the delegate is saying, that it's important to get kids involved. In my polling place, we've made it a tradition that when someone comes in for the first time to vote, we applaud for them as they cast their vote. And sometimes they're a little bit embarrassed, and sometimes you can see the smile and the pride as they cast their very first vote. It's an important part of being an adult. Every bit as important, or I would argue more important, than the driver's license or the other American symbols of adulthood. That voting is really important, and I think we need to make sure we're getting that word out in the schools. I think it's a patriotic thing to do. To encourage our children to vote, to go with our children to vote starting when they're little, but even I took my children as they turned 18, I took each one of them the first time to vote in person. And it's a very exciting thing to me as a citizen to help my children be adults in the democracy. And I think if more parents encourage their children in that way, that might help establish a lifelong pattern of voting. We do know that people who start voting early tend to continue voting. People who don't start voting when they're 18, when they say, I'll do it later, when I have a house, when I have a family, then I'll start voting when it really matters to me. But we know that if we start them early, they get hooked. They get
Right.
hooked on democracy, and that's a good thing.
I learned the danger of bringing a young person with you in to vote. Our son was about 8, and we went in to vote. And it was a year that Arlington had about 4 bond referendums on the ballot. And I was going to vote yes for all of them. Very supportive for education, parks, all that. And he was watching everything I did. And I clicked yes, 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 yes. And he wasn't reacting on the issues. He just said, really loud voice, "You're going to vote yes on everything? What are you doing?" And then I started saying, "Secret ballot, it's a secret ballot."
They do not know secrets.
They do not know secret
No.
ballot at all. So, but I think that is important. But I also, so the other thing I've noticed is, and I haven't done a study of this, but it seems like people that live in neighborhoods that have very active civic associations and have very active and good civic association president, and I think I've got a couple people in Arlington, it seems like a lot of their street comes out to vote, like their nearest neighbors. So I think there's definitely a neighborhood level dimension to this where we have to encourage whatever the civic association is or whatever the association is or the church to really get people engaged in that way.
Maybe if we give them, leave, or I have a,
that's
a
a whole-
friend
yeah.
that's from another country, and she said, I can imagine not voting, right? They find it so prideful. And I brought my son, and he read everything I pushed. Barack Obama, yes! I was like, really? Really? And people are giggling, they were like, well, we know who you voted for. Okay, yes.
And that right to vote, it's important to recognize it's for all adults, including people with handicaps and
Absolutely.
disabilities,
Right.
including people who don't read and write English. We need to make sure that it's a universal franchise, and we need to encourage everybody to vote.
Absolutely.